Hey, what's up? It's GC Kinsey, and I am now the not-so-proud owner of a brand new US passport with the wrong gender marker. Let's talk about that. If you're a transgender, non-binary, and/or intersex American, you may have been royally screwed, pun intended, by a certain wannabe king issuing an executive order called Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. What in the word salad, which states that sex shall refer to an individual's immutable biological classification as either male or female, and attempts to define what that means using some hilariously bad biology. But what's not so hilarious is what this executive order means in practice, including the fact that federal documents like passports and social security records have to reflect your sex assigned at birth. It goes without saying that this is a massive violation of trans, non-binary, and intersex people's rights. Taking away our ability to have federal documents that accurately reflect who we are is dangerous. Think about, for example, how any kind of perceived mismatch between the way you look and what your ID says could put you under extra scrutiny when you try to cross international borders, which could lead to harassment, detainment, deportation, and even imprisonment, in the wrong prison for your gender no less. And not only is this dangerous for trans, non-binary, and intersex people, it's insidious for everyone, because it reinforces a very narrow understanding of what's considered normal gender and punishes anyone who appears to fall outside of that. Maybe you're a binary man or woman, and you're cisgender, meaning not transgender, and you're parasex, meaning not intersex, but do you really think that's enough to keep you safe from this? If you don't look enough like what the oligarchs in power think a man or a woman is supposed to look like, then you're going to be under that same scrutiny too. In fact, that's already been happening to a lot of women in particular in the name of keeping things like women's bathrooms or women's sports teams safe. I've lost count of how many times I've heard stories about butch lesbians, for example, getting caught up in this crossfire. So, as if this executive order wasn't bad enough, we weren't given any time to process it before it started going into effect. Typically, there's a period of 30 to 60 days between when an executive order is signed versus when it's implemented to give the relevant departments and agencies time to get things set up to follow it. But in this case, it was only 3 days before the State Department told the passport office to stop processing all gender marker change requests. They were clearly ready to go with this one. As you might expect, that sent a lot of people into total panic, because not only did we just have our rights yanked out from under us so quickly, we were also left with unanswered questions like, what happens if you've already updated your gender marker on your passport? What happens if you already have an X marker, which is apparently no longer valid? What happens if your passport is current with the correct gender marker right now, but it's set to expire while this administration is still in office? And what happens if you had a passport application out in progress before this executive order, but you haven't gotten it back yet? We started getting some answers in the days and weeks following this whole mess. They told us, if you've already changed your gender marker to F or M or X, your passport will still be valid, but it'll get changed back to your assigned gender the next time you renew. But even with that information, there were still a lot of unknowns around more specific situations. And there were horror stories emerging about things like people applying for passports and not receiving them, plus having all their supporting documents confiscated, or even being threatened with arrest while trying to update their gender markers. There were warnings about possible detainment at the border if you tried to exit and then re-enter the US with an X marker on your passport. So yeah, that was all really reassuring. And as the fun little cherry on top, I can now say that I have personally been affected by this. I spent a month and a half in passport purgatory thanks to this executive order until I was eventually sent a passport with my old gender marker instead of my new one. And I want to share what this experience has been like for me, along with some thoughts more broadly about gender markers on passports and IDs. Just as a disclaimer, this is all my personal perspective as a transmasculine non-binary person who is not intersex and who is undergoing medical transition. Other people will have different perspectives on this than I do, so I highly encourage you to listen to the stories of binary trans men and women, non-binary people who aren't transmasculine, intersex people whether or not they're also trans, people who haven't medically transitioned, people who have finished their medical transitions or are further along than I am. As many different voices as you can, because this affects all of us in different ways. With all that said, let's get into it. My passport shenanigans all began in the fall of 2023 when I had to travel outside the US for the first time since starting testosterone. I had last renewed my passport in 2018, which was still the early days of my transition. Like, I knew I was non-binary, I was out to all my friends as such, but I was still exploring what I wanted to do with my presentation and hadn't made any big changes to my appearance yet, certainly hadn't started any medical transition. So we're talking old picture and female gender marker, which is what I was assigned at birth. It never occurred to me that I might have issues traveling with that passport until the summer of 2023, when I had to show ID to get into the 18+ panels at an anime convention, and the person checking IDs didn't think the also old pre-transition photo on my driver's license looked like me. I was only 1 year on T at that point and a low dose to boot, so I didn't think that my face had changed much, if at all. Certainly not enough to warrant getting a new photo on my license. So I was completely shocked by this, and kind of gender euphoric about no longer looking like my old photo, but also kind of like, oh shit. Because I was supposed to fly to Canada a few months later, and I was hoping that my passport photo wouldn't cause that same kind of reaction at the border. I hadn't planned on renewing my passport until it was a lot closer to expiring, and until I'd had a lot more significant changes to my appearance, like when I could grow an actual beard instead of just a dirt stash. Otherwise, I knew I was just gonna have to update it again in a few years, and passport renewals are not cheap. So I was trying to aim for that sweet spot when I could renew it once with a new photo and gender marker and then leave it that way for the next 10 years. But I knew that wasn't happening before my trip to Canada, so I just went with my existing passport and hoped for the best. Fortunately, it was all super chill both entering Canada and re-entering the US. None of the security guards or border agents questioned whether the person in the photo was me. Nobody acted weird or transphobic about me still having an F gender marker with a dirt stash and a deeper voice. So then I was like, alright, cool, crisis averted. But I did start thinking a lot more seriously about when I should update my passport and how I should update my passport, aka which new gender marker I should choose. At that point in 2023, you could choose one of 3 gender markers on your passport, F, M, or X. And if you needed to update your gender marker, all you had to do was check a box for that on your renewal form. Simple, right? But it wasn't so simple for me, because even though I knew I needed to ditch the F, I wasn't sure whether I should change it to M or X. As a transmasculine non-binary person, neither marker would be wrong per se, but I wasn't exactly sure which one would be right. So I had a decision to make. If I were to go on pure instinct, I would pick X for sure. Anytime I fill out a form that asks for my gender, I always pick the non-binary or X or other option if I can. Because even though I am a masculine person and my social and medical transition might not look that different from that of a binary trans man, I am very much non-binary at my core, and I am constantly frustrated by how little room society gives non-binary people to exist. Even a lot of the trans-friendly people I encounter will try to affirm my gender by treating me like a binary man rather than a masculine NB. And even though that doesn't make me feel dysphoric the way being treated like a woman does, it still makes me feel uncomfortable. When I have to do that to myself by putting M down on a form, it makes me feel like I'm participating in my own erasure. So that's why my gut instinct always says, let's go with X. But choosing a gender marker for your passport is a much bigger decision than choosing one on some random form. And I don't make big decisions based on gut instinct, I make them based on logic and reasoning and lots of careful consideration. So I want to take y'all through my thought process and what kinds of things factored into my decision. Let's get a little chart going here. Reasons why I should pick X versus reasons why I should pick M. And here we go. First consideration. I live in a state that doesn't let you have an X on your driver's license, only F or M. That means if I want any form of ID with an X on it, it's going to have to be my passport, so put a point in the X column for that. But that would also mean the gender markers on my driver's license and my passport wouldn't match. Having X on one and M on the other would be kind of a transmasc NB flex, so put another point in the X column for that. But on the other hand, mismatched IDs could cause problems. I've never been asked to see my passport and my driver's license at the same time, but could it happen? Maybe. And if that happened and the gender markers didn't match, would it be a big deal? You never know, so just in case, put a point in the M column for that. Next consideration. X gender markers are still a relatively new thing that most of the world and all of its systems haven't caught up to yet, so having one on your passport could cause issues when you travel. Some countries don't recognize passports with X markers, which means an M or an F would give you more options of where you can travel, so put a point in the M column for that. However, would I even want to go to a country that wouldn't accept me for who I am? No, so put a point in the X column for that. Something else to think about, even if a country you're visiting does accept the X marker, that doesn't mean that everyone who has to see your passport will readily accept it. You might have to go through an agent who hasn't had any training about X markers, is ignorant about trans people, doesn't know how to handle the situation gracefully, ends up outing you to everyone nearby and putting you in danger. Or maybe the agent is straight up transphobic and sees the X marker and thinks, oh, you're one of those people, and uses it as an excuse to harass you or even deny you entry. So put a point in the M column for that. Next consideration is how I'm perceived. I talked in one of my other recent videos about how the way people read my gender is still really inconsistent, and that could lead to safety issues with passports. If it's a crapshoot as to whether people think I'm a man or a woman or an NB or they're just not even sure, then that implies having an X marker would be the safest option, right? Because X can mean anything, from non-binary to intersex to just none of your business. So if someone perceived me incorrectly as a woman, then an X on my passport wouldn't clash with that perception as harshly as an M would. An M in that case could open me up to even more transphobia and harassment, so put a point in the X column for that. On the other hand, if someone is already confused by my appearance, then an X marker might confuse them even more, whereas an M marker might help tip them towards seeing me as masculine. Plus, the longer I'm on T, the more an M marker should hopefully align with my appearance over time. So put a point in the M column for that. Next consideration, which might completely put a wrench in the previous one. I haven't legally changed my name and don't plan to. Using my initials worked just fine before transitioning and it still works just fine now. But of course, passports don't have just your initials, they have your full name spelled out. With that in mind, an M marker might be way less safe than X because M would be seen as the bigger mismatch with my name. So put a point in the X column for that. Next consideration. The only way X markers will grow more commonplace and gain more recognition is if people keep getting them. And that recognition would benefit NBs like myself as well as intersex people. And binary men and women, cis or trans, who don't look like they're expected to for their gender. Put a point in the X column for that. So here's where things stood in 2023 right after my trip to Canada. I had some very valid reasons for choosing either X or M. X was winning, but not by much. I wanted to take more time to decide, and give testosterone more time to work its magic on my face before I'd have to get a new photo. Fortunately, I wasn't planning to travel out of the country again until end of 2025, beginning of 2026 at the very earliest, and my passport was still valid until 2028, so I had that time. I used it to look into people's actual experiences with having an X marker on their passports, and I was surprised and discouraged by what I found. There were so many posts and videos of people saying they regretted getting an X gender marker, that they'd either changed it back or wanted to, that they didn't advise anyone else to get one because of how many problems it caused them while traveling. I was under no illusion that this was how the majority of people with X-gender passports felt, because most of the time people don't go online to talk about how good something is. They go online when they want to complain or shed light on something that's not working well. So there probably were positive experiences that I just wasn't hearing about. But even with the negative bias in mind, those stories still gave me pause, because the travel issues they described were worse than anything I had imagined. Plus, I didn't have any personal experience traveling with an X marker on my passport, and these people did. I did have plenty of personal experience with being openly non-binary in other situations though, and I knew exactly how hard that could be. When you're a trailblazer, you're always going to be coming up against friction. Some people will tell you, I don't want to blaze a trail, I don't want to deal with that friction, I just want to live my life, and they are 100% valid for that. I also know that if somebody doesn't blaze that trail, then it's never going to be there for the people who need to walk down it in the future. And I truly don't mind being one of those non-binary trailblazers. As challenging as it is, it's so rewarding too. But the hard question I had to ask myself was, do I want to be that trailblazer while I'm crossing international borders? Travel already stresses me to the max, flying especially. Flying out of the country, even more so. And I truly wasn't sure if I could handle one more stressor like an X-gender passport on top of all the rest of it. Plus, I travel solo most of the time, so I knew if I got into any kind of sticky situations, there'd be nobody to have my back but me. So, put a point in the M column for that. Now, X was still ahead, but only by 1 point. And then the 2024 US election cycle got going, which meant one more big consideration. The right wing had already spent the last few years majorly ramping up their transphobic agenda through state legislation, but now they were campaigning on it at the federal level too, in races for the House and the Senate, and of course the president. I knew that the more of these elections Republicans won, the more danger I would be in. I also worried that even if we did end up with a Kamala Harris presidency and Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate and no Project 2025, the political climate would still be terrible for trans people. Not catastrophic, but plenty bad, because it had already been getting worse under the Biden administration and too many Democrats were okay leaving us out to dry. So I reluctantly put one more point in the M column for that, because in this worsening political climate, having an X marker on my passport felt like it could be a target on my back. And look at that, we have a tie. So that's where I was stuck all the way up until the election itself. Of course, we ended up with the worst outcome, and there I was, still undecided about my gender marker, with the window closing fast on even being able to choose one. I didn't know what the new passport rules were going to be, but I was sure we wouldn't get to keep the Biden-era ones. So I gave myself a deadline. I said, you've got to make this decision and make sure they get your application before Inauguration Day. I thought about it extra hard while I did all the other legwork, like getting my new photo taken, getting the application fee together, filling out everything on the form but the gender box, and right around Christmas 2024, something finally broke the tie, which was, what happens if I'm on a plane that has to make an emergency landing in a country that doesn't accept X-gender passports? Earlier, I'd kind of dismissed the point about countries not accepting X passports by saying, well, those aren't countries I would visit anyway. But I hadn't even considered the risk of ending up in one of them by accident. That plane could always come down unexpectedly in a country that is hostile to trans people. So that was it. I sent off my renewal application requesting a gender marker of M. Renewing my passport with a new gender marker should have been an exciting milestone in my transition. It should have been something I celebrated, but instead it was just frustrating and bittersweet. Because even though M won the poll, deep down I had really wanted to pick X. Americans only had a short window from October 27th, 2021 to January 20th, 2025 when we could get an X on our passports, and I felt like I had squandered that opportunity, or the chance to get an X on any of my IDs ever, and I mourned that loss. I ultimately based my decision not on what I actually wanted, but on fears about my safety, which made me feel like a coward. I'd taken plenty of time to make my decision, but I still felt like the election rushed me at the end, not to mention heavily influenced my choice, which I resented. And making a choice that fell in line with the binary felt like a betrayal of myself, my community, and everything I stand for as a non-binary trailblazer and activist. And on top of all of that, I hated the idea of gender markers on IDs in the first place and still do. I don't think they're necessary. I mean, what purpose does a gender marker on an ID actually serve? When physical sex and gender identity and gender expression are all different things, when your presentation doesn't always match your anatomy, when your anatomy can change due to hormones or surgeries or heck, even just aging. How does a gender marker actually identify you, especially when a picture of your face is right there? All that gender marker does is give cops and border agents and others in power personal information about you that they don't need, especially if you're trans, non-binary, and or intersex and your gender marker outs you. So given that I would rather not have gender markers on IDs at all, having to choose between X and M was already less than ideal. And even then, I still had to settle for my second choice. So this first step in my legal transition wasn't something I felt like celebrating at all. I did try to find the silver linings. My photo finally looked like me, and it was actually pretty good. I had met my self-imposed deadline. The passport office confirmed that they'd started processing my application a week before Inauguration Day. I'd even paid for expedited processing so that I could get my passport back before the inevitable shit hit the fan. Unfortunately, I wasn't quick enough. So, the inauguration happened, the executive order happened, the subsequent widespread panic happened, and even though queer rights groups like the ACLU and Lambda Legal were giving good advice based on what they knew, one question that no one seemed to be able to answer was what would happen to people in my situation. If the passport office had started processing your application before the executive order, but hadn't finished processing it when the new rules went in place, then what gender marker could you expect on your new passport? Any reasonable person would assume that there would be a cutoff date, that any applications received before the new rules were put in place would be processed according to the old ones. But we weren't dealing with a reasonable situation, we were dealing with Nazi Germany 2.0, so who even knew if we were going to get passports, much less correct ones? I tracked my application daily, and it showed in process for 5 weeks before it finally switched to approved, and I got an email confirming that my new passport was on its way. It arrived with a form letter about how they couldn't fulfill my gender marker change request under the new rules, and my old F marker unchanged. So yeah, other than the photo actually looking like me now, this thing is basically useless. And what's even worse is that I didn't just renew my passport book, I also got a passport card. So that's $160 down the drain for nothing. Oh, and another $60 for expedited processing, which they didn't even do. It was supposed to guarantee processing within 2 to 3 weeks, and they took 5. Ever since I got my incorrect passport, it has taken every ounce of strength within me to resist the urge to blame myself. My brain wants to beat me up for not dealing with all of this sooner, for waffling so long between X and M, for thinking I'd be okay as long as they got my application before the inauguration. But what I'm doing instead is turning all of that rage and frustration away from myself and toward the people who are actually to blame for this. The president, of course, but also the Secretary of State for railroading these new rules in place, the passport office for complying with these rules and even using them as an excuse to take some people's passports and documents away, and every transphobic bigot who voted for this administration and got us into this mess. It's not my fault that my passport is incorrect, it's theirs. That's what I would tell anyone else who is in my shoes, and it's what I have to keep telling myself. The other thing I'm telling myself is not to lose hope because the ACLU is fighting this in court. I've linked in the description to more information about that lawsuit, which will hopefully put an end to this nonsense, or at the very least give those of us who've been screwed over by it a chance to get our passports corrected. But no matter how that case turns out, we can't give up fighting to fix this. I worry that too many of us already have, and that's the last issue I want to address in this video. The damage this executive order has done, not just to the individuals like me who've been affected, but to the trans community as a whole. Within hours after the executive order was signed, I started seeing discussions online about and amongst trans people that I found really disturbing. There were a lot of posts and videos advising anyone who'd ever changed the gender marker on their passport to revert it back to their assigned gender immediately, especially if they had an X. Telling people not to even attempt any sort of legal transition on their federal documents anymore. Complying in advance before we even had concrete rules out of this executive order, out of fear. I saw that same fear lead to an uptick in posts from people who were contemplating or even initiating detransition. Not because they weren't trans, but because they no longer felt safe being anything other than their assigned gender in this country. As I kept an eye on trans circles across social media over the days and weeks that followed, I saw an uptick in infighting and blame, much of which, surprise surprise, threw non-binary people under the bus, or used intersex people as a prop to support trans rights without giving them any voice or agency. I saw an astounding lack of empathy among different groups of trans and non-binary people who are affected by these new passport rules in different ways, and an increase in oppression Olympics type arguments about who has it the worst. Binary versus non-binary, medically transitioning versus not, visibly trans versus cis-passing, stealth versus open, you name it. All at a time when we really should be each other's strongest allies, not fracturing and splintering apart. I saw too much racism and not enough acknowledgement that regardless of all these other factors, we know who's going to have it the worst: trans, non-binary, and intersex people of color, particularly Black and Latina trans women and femmes, which we know from the annual trans murder monitoring statistics. Before our community regresses on all the progress we've made, before too many more of us lose hope, I just want to remind all my siblings that I know we're in a horrifying situation, but we have got to be better than this. Because this is exactly what they want. For us to be so scared that we give up or even turn on each other. We've got to remember our transcestors who came before us and the incredibly difficult situations they lived through and how they fought to get things to where they are for us today. And we've got to be that for the future generations who will come after us. We're seeing in real time just how much damage one executive order can do, and it hasn't been the only one, and it won't be the last one. But instead of backsliding, we've got to hold the line and keep moving the needle forward. We've always been resourceful, we've always been resilient, and I know we can do it. We've got this. And with that little bit of a pep talk, now is where I want to wrap things up and turn the conversation over to you. Have you found yourself in passport purgatory due to this executive order? Have you run into any issues while traveling? Do you have any advice to share based on your experiences? How do you feel about gender markers on passports in general, and have you ever struggled with which one to choose? And as always, whether you're personally affected by this or not, what questions do you have about all this? I would love to hear from y'all and build some collective solidarity, so drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. You can also reach out to me on other social media. I'm GC Kinsey across all platforms. And while you're here, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I've got more vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person, along with cosplay music videos, cosplay tutorials, a bunch of cool resources for singers about voice changes on testosterone, and more right here on this channel. So make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for all of your support. Stay strong, hang in there, and I will see you on the next one.